So imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, drag you out in handcuffs, and hold your wife at gunpoint while she's half naked, all because they actually raided the wrong house. Now here's the kicker. When you tried to hold the FBI and the government accountable for that mistake, the government argues that you can't sue them because their agents had discretion in how they operated and planned that raid. This is the exact situation that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the court handed down a 9-0 unanimous ruling that could have big implications for everyone in the country. And now the 11th Circuit just reheard arguments in this case in light of what the Supreme Court ordered. So let's talk about what is now developing in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. So if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the Martin family, who were victims of an FBI wrong house raid back in 2017. Essentially, back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid in a suburban Atlanta area, and instead of going directly to the correct house on the warrant, one of the officers used his personal GPS device. He used, I believe, his personal phone, maybe Google Maps, and it routed him what he claims is to a completely different address, to a different home than was potentially on the warrant. He says that, it just took him to the wrong house, and it took him to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend and their 7-year-old son at the time. When the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades inside the house, and then pulled the boyfriend and Katrina Martin out of the closet where they were hiding with a shotgun. They pulled them out, handcuffed them, pointed guns at Katrina Martin, pulled her out half dressed, and eventually also pulled out the young child as well. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they were searching the home, and while performing that search, one of the agents actually noticed some mail on a coffee table and saw that the address was a different address from where they were supposed to be. That's when they kind of had this huge oh crap moment and realized that they raided the wrong house. The officers then left the home, told the family that they would be back soon to explain, and the officers then went about 3 homes down, which was actually separated by a cross street, so they actually kind of went a block over, and then executed the raid against the correct home. Now, in response to this whole situation, the family sued the FBI and the federal government, and they brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The government claimed immunity from this lawsuit under the discretionary function exception to the FTCA, and asserted that this case must be thrown out. Now, on review, the lower court originally sided with the FBI and the government, but eventually the Supreme Court reviewed this case and stepped in, and they disagreed with what the lower court said. The Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in this case, and the Supreme Court made something very clear. You don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. Because of this, the Supreme Court then sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to apply the correct standard and take a fresh look at this case. So this case was sent back down to the 11th Circuit, and the 11th Circuit has recently heard new arguments in this case. And this is where things kind of get very interesting for this issue. The judges on the 11th Circuit panel during the arguments focused heavily on one key issue. Where is the line between policy discretion and basic operational failures? Throughout those arguments, several judges pressed the government on this exact point. One of the biggest questions really was, how can executing a warrant at the wrong address possibly be considered a protected policy decision? How is that discretion? The judges seemed very skeptical that something so fundamental like simply identifying the correct house on a warrant could fall under anything like a discretionary function or discretionary immunity. There were also a lot of questions about whether the government's theory would actually take this too far. So in other words, if this counts as discretion, then what would not count as discretion? Because under the DOJ's argument, almost any mistake during a law enforcement operation could be reframed as a discretionary function or some sort of judgment. As one of the judges put it during the arguments, everything involves a person's choice or judgment. If the government's line of logic is followed, then everything would be covered by this immunity. Now, at the end of the oral arguments, the court told both sides that it would let them know whether it wanted additional briefing on how the Supreme Court's ruling impacts the negligence issue, because one of the key things with this is both sides said that they do not want this to go back down to the district court. They want the 11th Circuit if this goes a certain way to actually rule on the merits. So the 11th Circuit said at the end of the oral arguments, well, do you want us to do additional briefing? Because if we decide to reach the merits on the negligence issue, do we need more briefing on that topic? In response to that, both sides really said, we're not necessarily opposed. We could file briefs, but both sides believed that enough information and evidence and arguments have been submitted to the 11th Circuit for them to actually rule on this case and eventually also rule on the merits. So the 11th Circuit told the parties that if they wanted that additional briefing, they would let them know within the following week. But that time has kind of come and gone now, and no additional order has not been issued. So what does this tell us about where this case is heading? This strongly suggests that the court is not going to request additional briefing, and instead the court is likely moving straight towards deciding this case. So in other words, the judges believe that they already have what they need to rule on this issue. They believe that they don't need more arguments or more briefs or any additional analysis based on the Supreme Court ruling that was kind of already submitted to them, but they don't need more analysis based on the negligence issue, and they're just simply going to work towards a final decision. Now, during the arguments, the DOJ essentially doubled down on their prior position. They claimed that everything leading up to the raid, including surveillance, navigation, and execution, involved discretionary decisions. And because no specific rule actually dictates exactly how agents had to verify the address, they argue that the discretionary function exception still applies. But the judges did not seem fully convinced because a lot of the questions were based on, how did you operate? What did you do to verify the address? And many of the, officers made statements that they did not double check mailboxes. They wanted to execute this as fast as possible, so they were not identified. The numbers were not on the home, but they believed it looked, kind of similar. They believed one of the cars looked like a correct type of vehicle. And really, they did not do any additional checks to make sure it was the right home, but they also had some pre-surveillance, I believe, on the correct house. Now, on the other side, the plaintiffs made a much simpler argument. They told the court that this isn't about policy. This is about a basic non-discretionary duty. You have to actually hit the right house on a warrant, and that's not a judgment call. That's the bare minimum requirement of executing a warrant properly. And that argument appeared to really resonate with a lot of the judges on the panel. So what does this all suggest about where the case is now heading? Well, based on the tone of the arguments, there are a couple likely pathways. I think maybe one of the more possible pathways is that the judges here rule in favor of the family, saying that yes, their FTCA lawsuit should be allowed to move forward. It should not have been dismissed. This is not a discretionary function. It does not fall under that type of exception. And so maybe they narrowly say, yes, this case can move forward. But then the whole merits issue of negligence comes up as well, because both parties wanted the 11th Circuit to also rule on the merits if they got that far. I think in this situation, the court could draw a very clear distinction between protected policy decisions and basic operational negligence, and simply say that this was clear operational negligence because you don't have discretion to get the wrong, house. You have the warrant, you have the address, and that is the basic function of operating these raids, is making sure that you have the right house. And to fail to do that is essentially negligence. So that could be a very narrow ruling that they issue in this case. But either way, after the arguments, it appears that the government is in a much weaker position, especially based on what the Supreme Court said in that 9-0 decision. So this is something that we're now going to be watching for. It does not appear that the 11th Circuit is going to request any additional briefs. Instead, they're going to move directly to ruling on this issue. So that's the latest update in this major Fourth Amendment accountability case. This is kind of the impacts of that Supreme Court 9-0 ruling. And as soon as we get that ruling from the 11th Circuit, which could be very significant, I will let you guys know and keep you updated. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you all for your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.